Hi folks, welcome to my channel. In today's Paint With Me, I'm going to show you how I paint a person's eye using watercolour. All the art supplies will be listed in the description box if you want to go and check those out, but don't forget that you don't have to have exactly the same supplies as I have to paint along or try this at home. If you are trying this at home as you watch this video, remember that you can pause the video or change the speed of the video in YouTube settings. And lastly, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment and subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon if you'd like to be notified when I upload a new video. And I am uploading 2 videos a week now, that's on a Tuesday and a Friday. So let's get started. Now, if you saw my Draw With Me video last week, you'll know that I drew an eye for that as well. But with watercolour, there are some big differences in the techniques you can apply. So I'm going to share my method and processes as well as a few tips. But as I've said before, this is just my way, not the only way or even the right way, but I thought I'd share it with you. So I'm going to start off with step 1, and that is the same as before, to get an accurate sketch. Now the difference is with watercolour is that your sketch does need to be really light, because once you paint over it you won't be able to erase those lines. So that's a bit different to, say, drawing with pencils and that kind of thing. You can usually erase lines if you don't want them to be visible, but with watercolour, for some reason, once you paint over them you can't then rub them out. So get an accurate sketch, but make sure it's really pale. If you've only got an HB pencil, then you can kind of take some of that graphite off with a kneaded eraser. And make sure, my first tip is to use paper that is suitable for use with water. I'm using the Arches or Arch cotton cold pressed paper, but you don't have to use that. You can use whatever supplies you've got, but do make sure that your paper is good for use with water, because if you use printer paper or some sketch paper and it's not meant for water, then you can have a real job with your paints and your paper can buckle and even tear. So having the right paper is a really important thing when using watercolour. So as you can see here, I've already got a very faint outline sketch, and I will zoom in when we get to the painting. I've also put tape around the outside, and it's a really good idea to tape down your paper when using watercolours. Now I haven't actually taped it to my desk because this paper is in a block, so it's sealed all the way around the outside except for a little bit in the top here where you can remove the paper once you're done. But if you're just using a loose pad or something, then it's a really good idea to tape your paper to either a board or your desk, and that will help to minimise any buckling of the paper as you add water, because the paper does have a tendency to curl up, and that can then lead to puddles of water and so on that might spoil your drawing. So that is the first step. Get an accurate sketch on the right paper and tape it down. You can stretch paper as well, but I won't go into that today because that's a bit more involved, and generally I don't tend to do that, so that might be something that I've got to try later on. But just for the sake of today, taping is great. What tape you use is up to you. I generally use the Scotch magic tape, which you can see here, and that's pretty good. It doesn't bleed underneath that, but if you're worried about the tape you're using, do test it out on a piece of your paper first. Some tapes are really sticky and they can tear the paper when you try and remove it. Top tip for that is to use a hairdryer to remove your tape, or try and put it onto your jeans and get a bit of lint on there so it doesn't stick too well to your paper. But you can use washi tape, and there are lots of different tapes you can try as well. So once we've got those things ready, you then need to decide on which technique you're going to use, because that depends on what result that you want to achieve. So some people paint quite loosely with watercolours, and other people go for more of a precise sort of photorealistic type of effect. So there are 2 different types or main types of technique with watercolour, and that is the wet on wet, where you pre-wet your paper and then add paint from your paintbrush, which is wet also, so that's wet on wet. Or you can have the wet on dry technique, which is where you keep your paper dry and just apply paint with a wet paintbrush. Usually it's quite hard to control water with a wet on wet method, but we're going to try and do a bit of both today so you can see the differences. Okay, so before we even start painting, I'm just going to mix up a few colours before we get going, and I will zoom in on this so that you can see it a bit more closely. So if you haven't got all the paints that I've got, don't worry, because even with the 3 primary colours, you can mix together some really nice skin tones. Okay, so I'm just going to show you how I mix together some flesh tones really quickly. I also wanted to say that I do have 2 jars of water, and I usually do that because it's good to have one for clean water and one for dirty water. So you clean your brush off in the dirty water and then rinse it in the clean water, and that way you minimize any sort of muddying of your colors when you then go to use that water on the paper. So to mix up some really nice skin tones, obviously it would depend on what sort of skin tone you're drawing and what color that is. But basically I have got a flesh tone that you can see here, but I do think it's got some white mixed into it because it's not so transparent. So I'm just going to go with using a cadmium red light here. This is just a really cheap palette. I'm going to add some water to that. I also like to have a bit of paper just to try out my colours as I'm going along, not my actual paper. I'll put that to one side so it doesn't get paint on it, but that way I can check how the colour's going to look on the paper rather than just testing it on the palette. So we've got some cadmium red light, or some red, and if you mix in with that some yellow ochre or yellow, it might look a bit orangey to start with, but we can test that out. And adjust it. The other thing about watercolours is that they do dry a lot lighter. So that's not looking too bad actually for my skin tone that I'm after. I might even go with that. And make sure that you make up enough to start with. I'm going to make up a little bit more because I thought I'd do the area around the eye as well, just that you can have a look at the skin tones and the area around the eye. So with watercolour, it's all about getting the balance between the paint and the water, and trying to control that flow of water can be quite hard and can take quite a lot of practice. So practice is really important with watercolour. So I'm quite happy with that colour, and as you can see it's starting to dry quite a bit lighter. So we're going to go with that to start with. Now the other thing to mention is that's important is using the right brush. Now you don't have to have a whole range of brushes, but it's a good idea to use the right size brush if nothing else. So let's get that in the camera. So for larger areas, it's best to use the largest brush you've got. This one is a size 12 and it's a round brush. So use that for the largest areas, and then for the more details areas that we're going to go into, like the pupil and the iris, then you can use smaller brushes. Obviously there's a difference between synthetic and sable brushes, but that's probably going to take me too long to explain all those. So just make sure that you've got a couple of different brushes that will make life a lot easier. So let's start off by doing the wet in wet technique. So this is when you wet the water. Nope, you don't use the wet water to wet the paper. And I'm just going to go on and put some down there like that. You don't want massive puddles, but you almost want it to have a little bit of a sheen to it. Too much water isn't good, but not enough for the wet on wet technique at least. It means it will dry too quickly and your paint won't flow nicely. I like using the cold pressed paper because it does have a bit of a texture to it. If you've used cold pressed paper before, you'll know what I mean, but it's not completely smooth. And it does tend to dry a bit slower than hot pressed or completely smooth watercolour paper. And I like that because it gives you a bit more time to think and to work. So I've generally gone in and all the areas, I haven't gone over the eye. Some people do with watercolour if they're working more of a looser style. I've got to perfect that yet. I'm practicing it and trying it, but I tend to keep going back to doing it really detailed. But anyway, I'm not sure if you can see this. This has got a bit of a sheen on. I can see that I've missed a bit there. Okay, so when it's just glossy like that is a good time to add your paint. So we're going to go in with some of the skin tone that we mixed up, and I'm just going to put it all over. It's going to look really scary and dark, but it will dry lighter, trust me. Now if you were using I could use a bigger brush than this actually. If you were using a really small brush, this would take ages and your paper might dry before you've had a time to put it all in. And add a bit more water. And so it might be a bit streaky and what have you, so it's a good idea to use the biggest paintbrush you can without losing control or the ability to get the details you need to. So that's a quick covering of everything. I'm just going to go. Now the other thing with watercolour is you can use several different techniques, but the white of the paper is the lightest you'll get because I'm trying to talk and paint now. This is going to prove difficult. The light of the paper is the lightest you'll get, so you need to kind of preserve those areas, and that can add a really nice dimension to your painting. And it doesn't matter if you leave a few white streaks. And also at this stage, when it's still wet, you can sort of drop in colour and it will still blend. Watercolour is all about control, and I don't know by any means all there is to know about watercolour, and that's why I say I'm only sharing with you the way I do things, because there's probably watercolour artists out there who've spent years practicing and are cringing in their seats at what I'm saying. So do bear that in mind. I don't profess to know everything about anything actually. So we're just going to do that. There is a point where the paper starts to dry and you can't add any more. And skin tones aren't flat, there's lots of different colours in there, and you can actually drop in some skin tones on top. So you can add some brown colours, you can add in some blues. Sometimes there's a blue or violet tinge, and the eyes I'm painting today are actually baby's eyes, so we've got some really nice smooth skin to work with here, but I'd like to experiment a bit more with different skin colours and textures as well. So I might next week do some wrinkles or something like that, because that'd be interesting. Okay, I think we've just about reached the limit of this colour. So what we need to do with watercolour is make sure that we are patient and allow our paper to dry between layers. So if I was to go in and start on the pupil and the iris and the white of the eye now, because this paper here is still damp, you'd get your colours bleeding out because the paint will go where the water is. Even if this bit is just the slightest bit damp, the paint will tend to bleed into that. And although you can get some nice effects with that, and that might be what you want, it might be your style, it's more of a looser way of working, it can be a bit uncontrollable, and if it's not what you want, then you do need to make sure that you let that paper dry in between layers. So I'm just going to blast this with a hairdryer, and I'll be right back for the next step. Okay, what I'm doing now is I am just lifting up with a bit of kitchen roll some of the areas where I thought it had dried too dark. So all you do for that is you just wet your paintbrush with clean water, you apply another coat of or layer of water, not too much again, and that kind of reactivates it a little bit, and you can pull up or lift some of that colour. And that's a really useful technique in watercolour that you can use to lighten. It depends on the quality of your paints and which paints you're using, because some colours will be more staining than others, some will lift better than others, but you can always get information from the packaging or from the manufacturers of your paints if you want to know more about individual colours and how they stain and that kind of thing. But it is really useful to be able to do that. I think what we're going to do now is I am just going to apply another layer of water on some of these areas and drop some darker shadows in, just to give it a bit more depth around the outside of the eyes, and then we're going to do the eyes. Okay, I'm going to dry this and be right back. Okay, so that's all dry. Another tip that I've got is if you want to check if your paper is dry, it may be obvious, but sometimes it can look dry but it's still damp. So if it feels cold to the touch, even though it might appear dry, it might still be wet. So give it another little while just to wait till it's properly dry. Okay, so we've kind of done a rough outline for the skin around the eyes. Now we're going to move on and work on the whites of the eyes and the iris and pupil. So as you probably may or may not know, the white of the eye is not 100% white. It will look more realistic if we add in a bit of colour, especially in the corners and underneath the lid there where you've got the cast shadow from the eyelid. So I'm going to use a little bit of cerulean blue, I think. I'm just going to go in, I'm not going to use the wet and wet too much on the white of the eye because I want to try and control a bit more where the paint's going. So I'm just going to add in with a smaller paintbrush. I've switched down to a smaller paintbrush, and although again this looks quite bright and strong for the white of the eyes, it will dry lighter, remember, and we can lift it a little bit if needs be if it doesn't. As I said before, it's all a bit of a balancing act, getting to know your paints and the sort of the water to paint ratio and how things lay down and dry. Depends on your paints, depends on your paper a little bit as well. But yeah, all a bit of trial and error. But I'm going to try and do them both at the same time, and then we can work on one while the other one is drying. Just going to go in and do a bit of a base layer, really light on the iris here. And with watercolour, it's good to think about your method, which way you're going to do things, which order you're going to do things in. But sometimes with watercolour, it doesn't always go according to plan, so be prepared for that. I'm just going to go in and lift a little bit out. So for lifting, I generally use quite a cheap paintbrush, and it's got quite a firm bristle to it. So you can just go in and gently rub not too hard, otherwise you'll dig holes in your paper. Gently rub like that, and then blot with your kitchen roll. Okay, for the pupils then, I'm going to use a very small paintbrush. This one, it's a size 0, it's a miniature painting one. It's not expensive, I think it was really cheap actually. But just because it's got quite a firm round point to it. The eyes I'm drawing are really blue, and I'm going to go in with a Prussian blue, I think. Right, I'm just going to wet the area right outside the iris. The rest of the eye is dry, but then if I drop in this Prussian blue, it might not be dark enough, but because there's a little bit of water on there, it moves into the water and gives that sort of bleeding effect, which is quite fun and quite good for eyes. I'm just going along with some clean water right up next to that line I've drawn on the outside of the iris, but I'm also being mindful of where the highlights are. Now that was something I was going to say as well, is that you can use masking fluid to block out the whites of the eyes and areas that you want to preserve, and then you haven't got to worry about painting over them by mistake and that kind of thing. But being that I was going to use a hairdryer to try and speed up the drying time, hairdryers and masking fluid don't really go. What you find often is that when you put the hairdryer or masking fluid, it kind of bakes it onto the page. So I didn't want to do that, so I've kind of deliberately not used masking fluid, but you can always do that. It makes life a little bit easier if you've got time to wait for it to dry naturally. Maybe some masking fluids don't, but in all those that I've tried before, it can be a bit of a problem. So let me know if you know of a masking fluid that doesn't bake onto your paper when you try and dry your watercolour painting. I haven't found one yet. Right, I'm just going in with a bit more, it's an indigo blue, this one actually. It's a lot darker because this eye is super dark. And that's something I love about watercolour, is that you can layer it and build up your colours. The only thing I am conscious about, and this is a personal sort of problem of mine I suppose, is that I tend to overwork things. Now I'm going to add some more colour to the iris. So I don't want it as dark as the indigo, so I'm going to go back to that Prussian blue, I think. I'm going to start over here. With eyes as well, you have to look at all the different shapes in the eyes, and it depends if you're trying to get it super realistic or loose again, doesn't it? But generally all these little specks in the eye will radiate out from the pupil. Right, other eye, same thing. I might put now for the pupils, and for the pupils you can use black, but I've mixed up some sepia and some Prussian blue. You can put a little bit of red in there as well, just because black can look a bit flat. So So just getting a nice amount of that in there, and going on to the dry paper and putting that in for the pupil, leaving the highlight. Okay, I think I'm going to use some of that just to go around the shadow area on the top as well, and also just above the area there. If this looks tilted now, it's because I've just slightly tilted my paper after I hair dried it, because it helps me to see. And also sometimes if you're working with your work flat on the table and you're sitting down, you can get a bit of a distorted perspective of how things look. So I like to tilt my painting surface sometimes. It's really darkening this area up here. Get that contrast in. And last week when we were doing in pencil, we put in the darks first, but with watercolour you very much work from light to darks. So around the outside, and then I'm going to do the other eye the same. Let's do the creases. We've got a crease that comes over the eye like this, and I'm going to do that in, I think, a dark brown. So I'm going to mix some sepia. It's quite greeny, so I'm thinking I might put a bit of more of a reddy mix into that. Let's just rinse off our brush, and I think I am going to just add some clean water. Actually, let's use a bigger brush above that crease, just to blend it out a little bit. I'm just going to do a little bit of clean water, use of the wet area at the moment, just to get some more shadows. That's one done. We'll let that dry before we go and do anything else, and I shall do the same on the other side. Right, so I've done the other crease on the other eye, and now I'm just going to build them up. And what I've done is, on my palette with my sepia, I've just added a bit of the red that I used to mix the flesh tone in the first place, and I'm just going to thicken this up a little bit. Which might look really dramatic, but it's going to dry lighter. Right, I'm now marking in the line where the eyelashes are going to go. And this is going to bleed a bit because it's still wet, but that's fine. And do the same in the corner as we did for the other eye, so I'm just putting in a little bit of that brown mix that we used for the crease, and then with a clean wet brush just go right up alongside it, and it gives you that shading. And do the same in the other eye. Just adjusted the shape of that eye slightly because I think it was looking a bit odd. Okay, same on the other side. Now we're just going to do some eyelashes and eyebrows, and I thought I'd do the eyebrows first because they're at the top, and I'm going to use this old Filbert brush again. It's good because it's quite firm, and I'm going to use it quite dry, so that's another technique that you can use on watercolour, and that's the dry brushing technique. So you just literally use a dry brush and a little tiny bit of water just to make it flow. And do the same on the other side. I think it could be a little bit darker, but we can add some more onto that afterwards. Let's go on and do the eyelashes. So I've mixed up some more of the dark colour, the same that I used for the pupils. So there's some blue, some red, some brown in there, or you can just use black. And I'm using my very fine paintbrush here. I'm just going to mop up some of those in drips so they don't spoil the work. And I'm going to start on the left hand side. So eyelashes, you have to pay attention to where they start and the direction. So they kind of go fan out from the eye. They don't all go in the same direction, but they do kind of curl up. So I'm just going to start at this end and kind of concentrate on where they're going, and we don't want them too thick. And they're sometimes in clumps as well, so you get some bunched together. Now we've just got to do the eyelashes on the bottom lid, and these are often a lot shorter and a lot more sparse, so we're just going to do a few, but again they come up and over in the same way. The top ones curve up like that. So that is pretty much it. I'm just going to do a few finishing touches. I might add some darker, that dark area I've just used for the eyelashes. I think I'm just going to go in and darken up that pupil in the centre at least, and then I will come back to you. folks, I think that's it for today. It's been a great fun. I've really enjoyed doing this and I hope you've learned something from it. So if you have and you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you all in the next video next Tuesday. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.